I'll put the main cam back in place. So I want to lubricate it with some molybdenum paste. So I'll do all the bits I need in the shutter at the same time. Underneath this arm, where it contacts the shutter release, I'll put some there. Likewise, where the shutter release contacts the B lever. Where this arm drops in against the blade actuating ring there, I'll put a touch on there. On the blade actuating ring there are two little studs, one here and one there, where the main cam connects to it or picks it up and moves it. And the main cam here, I want to run some around that curved surface. That's where it runs against the retard gear train through the centre, and that should just about cover it. I'll put the main cam into the shutter, bring it round to its rest position. I have the main spring ready to go in place. This one has a lot more tension. So what that mostly, when the springs lose their tension, the shutter may work fine when it's been freshly serviced, but inevitably as the shutter gets a bit sticky with age, when the grease is aged and things aren't running as smoothly as they might, what tends to happen is that the blade actuating ring doesn't have enough energy at close to the park position to pull the blades fully shut against the resistance of the retard gear train. So that's all a problem at the point where it's trying to close the shutter blades. That's where the spring has its least tension. There we go, that's hooked into place. So if we cock that shutter, so release. This had the self-timer in place, that would pull back on that and release the shutter. So that's all good, that's working. That moves smoothly enough. I'm going to put the speed trains in place now. So I want to cock the shutter, take the retard gear train, drop that into position, pull back on this lever here so that that lever is not on top of the tab on the blade actuating ring but behind the tab. That little tab moves the lever in the blade, the retard gear train, which effectively disengages the pallets. So it means that there's no resistance in the retard gear train until the shutter has been released. This screw at this end in position. Yep. Flipped over for one reason or another. Let's pick that up again, have another go. That's better. Now the hole that this smaller screw goes through is oversized, which allows for adjustment of the position of the retard gear train. So you can swing it inwards for greater engagement or outwards for lesser engagement, and that means that you can effectively slow down or speed up the action of the retard gear train. Our self timer fits on here. Get that in position. There's a single screw holds that in place. Just making sure that the retard gear train, the self timer is actually seated correctly. The operating lever for this is down underneath here. Right, that all appears to work nicely. That shutter was not 100 miles away. It's certainly close enough for me to think about testing the speeds. Right, well, I'll clean up the shutter speed cam plate and this cocking cam here, which cocks the shutter from the back, and put them back in place and then test the shutter. Right, well, cocking the shutter, I've got this set to an 1/8 of a second. If I release the shutter, it's much too quick. So that tells me that my retard gear train needs to be swung inwards for greater engagement with the main drive cam. So that's what I'll do. First I'll cock the shutter. Loosen this screw slightly, swing the retard gear train in very slightly. Do that screw up again. Put the settings plate back in place. Put its retaining ring on to hold it. I've tightened this using a toothpick, not using a screwdriver, because I don't want to scratch it to death. Right, that's set to an 1/8 of a second. It's cocked. What's it like? That was more believable. It was too quick, but it was closer. What's it like on a 15th? Yeah, certainly too fast. So I've got to go back in, make another slight adjustment. And at that stage I should be close enough that I can go out to my shutter speed tester and actually test and see what the numbers tell me. Now I'm as far in as I can get there without adjustment, so I may need to make an adjustment in a different way if it's still too fast. Let's put my retaining ring on there. We need to be cautious putting a retaining ring on like that because it's quite a large diameter. It's quite a fine thread and the ring itself hasn't got much structural strength, so it's easily distorted, and if it's distorted then you will not get the thing to run on smoothly, if at all. Right, what's an 1/8 sound like to me now? Alright, that sounded close enough for me to go and test that. Back shortly. Well, that worked out very well. The shutter speed was slightly slow on the 8th, slightly fast on the 30th. So it means that my position there is probably as good as it's going to get, basically. It's the appropriate compromise. That was the 1 second. That sounded pretty good to me. Okay, well that's basically sorted then. I can close up the shutter based on that. So I've taken the retaining ring off. This diaphragm setting ring here has got a small notch in it, which has to line up with that tab on that lever there. So I'll get that in position. This shutter speed piece here is a notch in here, has to couple with a little tab on that speed ring there. So I'll get that seated. That looks good. The setting ring here has to line up with those tabs. That looks good. The front plate has a series of notches in it, or serrations. That's where the detent for our shutter speed settings couple to. Make sure I've got all this seated correctly. Put that plate on. The plate only goes on in one position. There's a little pin that comes up from the mechanism plate, locates into a hole at the front there, stops that ring from turning. I can put my retaining ring on the front. That's the one I had temporarily on the front while I was testing the shutter speed. Now I've got to get this started. That's better. You've got to take your time getting that seated. Just run that down with a wooden toothpick. Check that everything's seated correctly, that my aperture tab here is coupled with that ring. The shutter speeds are obviously coupled. You can hear the detent clicking away there. So my retaining ring at the front here, if you have it down too hard, the settings will be too stiff. I'm going to back it up to the next notch. That feels pretty good right there. And the retaining screw for that ring was that little black screw. And that's very easily lost, so you're going to be quite cautious about dealing with that. It's not always easy to get it screwed in tight because it's very short. You're only engaging probably about, I don't know, not much more than a turn of thread. Just clean that front surface and check the shutter again, make sure that everything works. We cock it here. I'll set the self-timer because we haven't tested that. What shutter speed are we set to? We're set to half a second. And we'll release it here. You can hear the self-timer running down. There we go. So that's moving, that's working nicely. I can put the lenses back into there. So I've got to clean them first, I suppose. We have 3 pieces of glass to be concerned with. This is the centre element, and looking at this I can see that it's a bit dusty on the surface that's closest to the shutter blades. The outer surface here, that's got our thread in it that the front element screws into. That grease is very sticky looking, so I've got to get that grease cleaned out first, otherwise we'll be going nowhere. So I'll start with some naphtha on a cotton bud, and I'm trying to keep, you can see that filth coming off there, I'm trying to keep this away from the glass if I possibly can, because otherwise I'll end up with greasy smears on the glass, which then I've got to struggle with to get rid of. There's a lot of muck there. That grease is, it probably didn't start off all those colours, so it's probably picked up a lot of dust. That's looking better. The thread in there now looks uniformly shiny. And I'll clean that one more round with the naphtha. I'm cleaning the mount, I'm not cleaning the glass itself. I'm keeping away from the glass surface as much as possible. But I need to clean the mount to make sure that any grease or oil, and certainly there is some there, gets cleaned away. Oh, another round again, I think, looking at that. Right, I'm quite happy with the state of that. I'll just blow that dust out of there, and I will clean the glass surface with just normal domestic glass cleaner. This surface was the one that was most dusty. That looks good. I'll get another cotton bud and glass cleaner and clean this surface. I can judge by reflections of the window light from the coming in from my right here that I've got that glass nice and clean. You can judge by the reflections whether you've got it nice and clean. You'll notice if there are any smears. It's not so easy to judge when you're looking at a heavily concave surface. Okay, so that's back in place. I'll just tighten that up there. It doesn't need much tension. I'm just looking to make sure there are no threads of cotton from the cotton buds caught in the threads. There's a little bit right there. That looks good. And the front group here, I'll need to clean all the grease and rubbish off that. So I start with that one. Basically it's the other half of the piece we've just dealt with. It's a lot of grease. It's old, it's gone waxy. I need all of that off. So once I've got it nice and clean from a mechanical point of view, once I've got all the grease off there, I can come back in and clean the glass surface. This is where you use a lot of cotton buds when you're cleaning around lenses. You're forever having to change to a new one so that you do not end up with greasy smears on glass that you have just cleaned. Right, so now I can clean that glass surface because I've got all the grease away from that mount. And this surface is almost flat. In fact, it might be flat. So it's easy for me to judge by reflected light how clean I've got it, how free from smears That looks pretty good to me. Now I'll check that that runs in smoothly. Yep, that's going in smoothly. I'll clean that outside surface. Not because I need it to be, not because that's the final clean, it's because when the outside surface is clean, it's much easier to look in and see whether you were successful at getting the inside surface as clean as you'd like. And the glass in this case is very good. I'm very pleased with the state of that. So that's good. That lens moves in very smoothly. Of course I haven't put any grease on there yet. I'll do that shortly. But that's all clean and I know that that moves smoothly. That's great. Now I need to put the rear group in place. So I'll just want to open the aperture right up. To f3.5 in this case. Make sure I blow out any dust that was sitting in there. And let's look at the rear group. The rear group, we go in the same story again. Clean them out with naphtha. Make sure there's no grease or other contaminants on there, particularly in the thread round the back here. Clean the glass. With special interest for the inside surface because I don't want to be opening and closing this half a dozen times chasing stuff. That looks okay. Screw that in position. It's just screwed in very lightly at the moment. I'll clean the outside surface of that glass. And I can have a final check then to make sure that everything's good, and it is good. I'll put my 6-inch rule through those slots and I'll just do that lens up tight. Right. At that stage I could just about put that back on the camera, I think, because I can deal with my front group and I've got to glue back the name ring here, which by the looks of it was only ever held in place with a single spot of lacquer, and the ring on the focus scale ring here is also loose, and that's going to have to be glued back in place. So I'll just wind those screws back in so they're not fouling that. See if I can lift that ring off. This part I'll need to clean all that old glue away, so I'll have to get some acetone onto that. I have to be a bit more cautious about the name ring because I don't want to disturb the paint. So I'll clean that glue up and then move on.